So today we're talking about the different types of costs that you might include in your contracts and your bids and your proposals. And before we get into why you want to do that, I wanted to go over what those kinds of costs are. And you might not always have all of these in your jobs. Time related is a very specific thing, so sometimes that doesn't apply. But most projects include fixed costs and variable costs. And rather than quoting everything as a lump sum, which you might do when you're a smaller company and doing smaller jobs, once you start getting into the bigger things, you want to start splitting those apart. So let's look at what they are. So fixed costs are the things that don't change when the project gets bigger or smaller. This includes costs like traveling to an out-of-town site, surveying, permits, and so on. These are all the things that you will pay for once. Sometimes there's a fixed cost and a variable cost built into things. Like, let's say, for instance, you're renting equipment for a particular project. The cost to transport that equipment to the site and from the site would be fixed costs, but the time-related or the variable costs would be the rental cost for the time that it's on site. So again, if you're doing a bigger job and these are things that you can't quite quantify up ahead of time, you want to think about splitting those things apart and having the fixed cost element and the variable cost element separate. And variable costs, as the name suggests, are things that change when the scope of the project changes. And the most common way that the most common one that you will have on every job is the materials, which is the number of fence posts or feet of mesh and those kinds of things. Also, direct labor and the associated overhead costs that you've assigned to your daily rate or your hourly rate or however you're going to work it out, and assigned to those things. So when you're installing a specific kind of post, there's a certain amount of time that's required for that. So that would be a variable cost associated with that kind of thing. So that's also why if you give someone a unit rate, you need to include both material, labor, overhead costs, accommodation, all those things in your rates so that you're covered for everything when you're progress billing. And then you've got time-related costs. So these are things that change depending on how long the work takes. They might apply to things like demolition. If there's not a clear idea of how long the demolition is going to take, it might be best for you to price it as an hourly or a daily rate. Might apply to things like standing time on site. A lot of bigger contracts in the fence world also do include day work rates. So your client will ask you specifically for rates for different kinds of labor, rates for different kinds of equipment, particular types of work that you're going to be doing. And this is so that they can set those things up beforehand so that if you have to do any of that work incidental to the main scope of work, they have something to refer back to when you claim those on your progress billing. So you might be asked to give those time-related costs. It's not always a requirement, but sometimes it is asked on especially bigger jobs. So now that we know what the difference between fixed, variable, and time-related costs are, the next big question we need to answer is why you should split fixed, variable, and time-related costs, especially on bigger jobs that tend to change over time. On smaller projects like a residential fence and stuff like that, a lump sum price is fine because even if something does change, you're going to negotiate it with your client at the time. And it's probably not going to be such a big change that's going to cost you a lot of money anyway, unless they're adding a whole new thing or changing the spec completely. But on bigger jobs, a lot of things can change over time. So you might be told you need to be on site right now to get something done, and then you get there and only half of the site is ready. So you finish the part that you can do, and then you have to leave and come back, and those kinds of things that might not have been accounted for in your original proposal. So it's very important to set up your pricing initially so that when you get to those points in the contract where there are those kinds of issues, you already have something to fall back on and you have some negotiating power. Because clients will very often try to take the easiest route, and I'm going to show you in a minute why that's a problem. So let's assume you've given someone lump sum pricing for 500 feet of fence at $50,000. You have fixed costs, which is your mobilization and demobilization costs at 5,000. So those are things like the time it takes for your crew to go to a site if it's out of town, shipping materials to site, shipping equipment to site, any orientations and stuff like that you have to do before you can get onto the site, permits, surveys, all those kinds of things. The one-off costs that you have before you can actually start working on the fence. And when you're leaving the site, it's the same thing. It's the last couple of days that you spend on site where you have to clean up and, all those kinds of things, shipping your equipment off site, travel time for your crews back to the office from wherever they've been, and those kinds of things. Those are sort of one-off costs that are not included or not accounted for in the variable cost of your fence. So now the fence line changes and you've given your customer a lump sum price. The fence line is now 400 feet instead of 500 feet. So your client divides the lump sum price by 500 because it was 500 feet. Then they get to the rate of $100 per foot and they use the rate of $100 per foot. So the new contract value is now $40,000. Still doesn't sound terrible. But what happens to fixed costs? $10,000 was initially included, which was $20 per foot of fence. So based on the new length, you now have only $8,000 included because they've taken 20 times 400. You've lost $2,000 of your fixed costs, but your costs themselves have not decreased. So this is why when you're working on bigger commercial kind of jobs and things like that, you really have to think about how to allocate costs in such a way that if things change, and they always do change along the course of a project, you'll be able to cover the costs that you have and you won't be losing profits. So you can negotiate this at a later stage, and I've had this happen very often in the past where a client has said, let's just reduce it by 100 feet and that's the rate per foot and all that sort of thing. And I said to them, no, but you don't understand what my fixed costs are in that, so we'll give you a quote. And sometimes they call this a cost to omit. What that means is there is a cost associated with making your fence smaller. The big changes and issues with this usually comes when something is left out or made smaller or something like that. Generally, if it's going to get bigger, your fixed costs are going to get bigger along with it. So it's not too much of a problem for you. You're actually going to make some money that way. But if things get smaller or things are left out or things like that, you definitely want to make sure that you've got those things split up, or that you tell your client, look, there is going to be a cost to omit or to make it smaller. So a lot of fence companies that I know of, and even some that I've worked for in the past, when they start getting into commercial projects and the bigger jobs where they're working with big general contractors or government or something like that, they're a little bit scared to move away from the lump sum pricing that they're used to giving their residential and their smaller clients. And they're a bit scared that the clients that they are talking to are not going to be open to this kind of splitting up of pricing. But the truth is, people who work in those kinds of roles, project management, engineers, architects, those kinds of things, they are very used to this. They're very used to having pricing split up this way. It's very standard in the construction industry. Some might even work with bills of quantities where they have different unit rates for different things and that kind of stuff. You don't have to go that far down the rabbit hole, although I am a fan of unit rates for certain things because it does make progress billing and claiming for extras easier down the line, but we will talk about that in another episode. So in this little section, let's talk about how to split fixed, variable, and time-related costs in your contracts, proposals, and bids if you're not used to doing it that way. So the most simple way to do this is to break the line items out, and this doesn't have to be complicated. If you want to just price per foot of fence, that's fine. You can, using the same example as we used previously, all you need to do is have your mobilization at $5,000 per trip, your fencing at 500 feet at $80 per foot instead of the $100, and then demobilization 1 at $5,000 per trip. Now this does several things. Firstly, if they change the length of the fence and it becomes less, your mobilization and your demobilization costs won't be affected. And you can do this with any fixed cost that you want to split and break out that way. I also like to do this obviously with gates and things like that, because just because your fence is going to change doesn't mean your gates are going to change and they're not going to become smaller. So I usually do line items for pretty much every different kind of thing, but that's up to you. But break those line items out so that if something does change, or if something is omitted or made smaller or whatever, those rates won't be affected. Also, if you are on a longer job where the client does say, right, we're not quite ready for you to do this work, so you need to leave and come back, you've got your mobilization and demobilization rates ready, so they know what they're going to be paying, and you can put that directly into your progress billing, so you'll get paid for that. Another good reason to do this is because when you first arrive at site, sometimes it's not that long before progress billing is due. And if your fixed costs are bundled up with everything else, you won't be able to charge for however many feet of fence, but you would be able to charge for that fixed cost for the mobilization. So you can at least recoup some of the funds that you've already spent getting to the site. So that's another good reason to break it out this way. If you are going to do this, and if you are going to make your fences remeasurable based on what actually happens on site, which is strongly recommended if you're working in this kind of project, you want to include somewhere in your estimate or your quote or your proposal or something like that a remeasurement clause. And that can be something like prices are based strictly on the lengths, quantities, specifications, and scope of work provided prior to quoting, and may be subject to change for any alterations to the same. I've put a clause like this in nearly every job I've ever done in the fence world for the last 25 years, and so many times it has saved my butt, because I was able to go back to the client and say, look, these things weren't allowed for, or this has been changed, there's a cost to omit, we need to break out some other costs, or it gives you a way to go back to the client and say, okay, I understand you want to change things, but because of the change, we got to recalculate some costs. Because obviously when things get smaller, you're also losing profits, and you had anticipated making a certain amount of profit on a project. So you want to make sure that you're not losing that by them making changes. So include a remeasurement clause on anything you do, whether you're doing, even if you're doing a lump sum job, it's worth having this in there, because that gives you that little extra legal leg to stand on when things do change, that you can update your pricing accordingly.